One time, while Country Bill White was buried alive in St. Petersburg, Florida, a woman walked up to his grave and shoved her 6-foot-long pet boa constrictor down his breathing pipe. How rude is that? Bill had been buried alive for 40 days straight at that point, and now he's got this snake in there with him? So Bill, he took one look at that reptile and he said, "Listen, fella, it's either you or me." And then he beat that snake to death with the telephone that he always kept in his coffin. The woman, she later tried to sue Bill for killing her snake, but as soon as they got to court, the judge took one look at that case and threw the whole thing out. It's a pretty wild little story, right? Bill White actually first told that story himself in 1977 while he was buried alive at a mobile home sales place in Dover, Delaware. The reporter, of course, was interviewing him through his breathing pipe. One time in the 1960s, Bill White was buried alive at a car dealership in Houston, Texas, when a country music band named Larry Butler and the Sunset Playboys came by to see him. Apparently, they had got the idea that it might be fun to record a song with a guy that was buried alive. So they lowered a microphone down on through Bill's breathing pipe and started up a tune, and right then and there they wrote a song called Graveyard Rock. According to Bill, it went a little something like, "Buried in a hole about 6 feet down, sucking on a beer way under the ground." And Bill, he actually enjoyed the experience so much that he launched himself a secondary career as a country music singer. And believe it or not, some of his music still survives to this day.
Earn my living in a curious way. People come from miles around to look me over, living down under, living in a hole in the ground.
Most of the time, when Bill was buried alive, he would eat stuff like scrambled eggs and raw onions and milkshakes and, stuff that was easy for people to pass down to him through the breathing pipe, right? But one time, while Bill was buried alive behind a motel in Melbourne, Florida, he found himself really, really wanting a hamburger. So he had somebody take a burger and roll it up into a little ball and then shove it down the tube for him. And when he got it, he said he didn't know whether to eat the burger or bounce that ball around the inside of his coffin. Sometimes people would ask Bill how he doesn't get bored buried under 6 feet of dirt for months on end. And his answer would always pretty much be the same thing. His trusty little telephone line. Never buried without it. Bill always had a phone line installed in his casket, and he always made sure that the local newspapers would publish the phone number. Day and night, Bill is constantly getting phone calls, and by his estimate, sometimes as much as 18 to 20 million a day. Wow. And he would always answer by saying the same thing. "Hello, you've reached the living corpse." He'd be doing interviews with reporters and calling into radio shows, but at the end of the day, mostly what he liked to do is just talk to regular people. Apparently, a lot of folk just like to call in and tell Bill about their problems.
People call me, some are happy, some are lonely, filled with tears. There's woe and care in the world up there, I may be better off down here.
All day long, Bill would be talking people through tough situations, everything from lonely women to runaway teenagers. And Bill, he had a theory on why people would treat him like sort of a therapist. It was because he was just a voice in the dark. They never see him, and he never sees them. And I guess that gives them the sense that he's a trustworthy confidant somehow. One time in 1968, a drive-in movie theater hired Bill to be buried alive in front of their movie screen. Here's a newspaper ad they took out promoting the event. Look at that. The skull's up there. That's got Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee. Great movie. Highly recommend. One time, Bill got real sick while he was buried alive, so he had some doctors lower him down some antibiotics and then some syringes, and he just gave himself a few shots, with the doctors giving him directions through the breathing pipe. All right, how about we take a quick break so I can show you a few pictures of Country Bill White. Like, here's a picture of Bill headed down under for a burial in Louisiana. And here's one of the tombstone that Bill would have placed on top of his grave whenever he was buried alive. And here's a picture of him that a reporter took by just aiming their camera down his breathing tube. And here's one that Bill took himself after somebody lowered a whole camera down to him. And here's Bill getting a drink after a tough burial in 1981. And, at this point in his career, he'd been getting buried for over 17 years, and he'd gone down under like 60 times. So I would think he deserves a drink, right? And wouldn't you know it, here he is again, 6 years after that, 1987, looking to get buried again. He kept this up for a long, long time. And finally, here's my favorite picture of Bill. This is him giving some advice to a waitress who wanted to try getting buried alive herself. Wasn't that nice of him? One of the biggest problems that Bill would face while he was buried alive was water. Too much rain and boom, all of a sudden, Bill's living in 6 inches of standing water in his coffin. And according to him, there really wasn't much he could do when that happened either. He just kind of had to deal with it. Although sometimes he would get a water pump lowered down through his breathing pipe so he could get some of the water out of there. And sometimes he would even have people send him down tiny little plywood boards so he could just build himself up a new floor and raise himself up out of the water. Once, Willie Nelson shook Bill's hand after a burial. Once, somebody shot a fire extinguisher down Bill's pipe and almost killed him. Once, Bill tried getting buried in a concrete tomb instead of his normal wooden coffin. And that little experiment ended with Bill having to get an oxygen mask lowered down to him and a bunch of guys working for 2 hours to break him out of his concrete tomb because he was suffocating to death down there. That was the most he's ever panicked in his entire life, according to Bill. Look at that giant bug. I just found him. In 1969, Bill White once took a gig where he was going to get buried in the stage of a gentleman's club in a clear plexiglass coffin where every night topless dancers were going to perform on top of him. That is a real story. Sure beats being buried in a used car dealership, Bill said. The number one question that Bill got beyond anything else was, how do you go to the bathroom? And Bill would always say the same thing. That is a trade secret. That is the key to my success. Nobody knows and nobody ever will know. That is the one thing that I will never tell. All right, how about a little love story? In 1966, Bill White was buried alive behind a concert hall in Fort Worth, Texas, when he started to catch himself kind of feeling a certain way about a woman that kept on calling his coffin phone. Her name was Lottie Howard, and every single day pretty much she was calling him, and Bill was answering, and they were just chatting and talking and chatting and talking for hours and hours and hours, and eventually Bill just kind of realized that he really liked this woman. And so the next time they talked, he asked her to marry him without ever having seen her and without her ever having seen him. And she accepted, and 24 days later, here comes Bill out of the grave, and there's Lottie waiting for him. Pretty wild romance, right? But not nearly as wild as the day of their actual wedding. See, pretty soon after Bill came out of his grave, Lottie actually decided that she wanted to try being buried alive. And then, before you knew it, there she was, buried alive at a drive-in theater, just like her fiancé. And, to make a long story short, they got married just like that. Like, there's a picture of it. There's old Bill slipping a ring onto Lottie's hand, and there's Mrs. Living Corpse buried alive, reaching her hand up through a hole in the ground, and they got a preacher there conducting the ceremony right next to him. That has probably never happened again since that day. Now, I hate to ruin a good love story, but I do got to tell you that Lottie and Bill's marriage just wasn't meant to last. Just a couple years after the wedding, in March of 1968, Lottie decided that she wanted a divorce. The only problem was that Bill was currently buried alive. So Lottie had her lawyer walk up to Bill's grave and shove the divorce papers down the breathing tube. And that is probably the first time and only time that has ever happened in human history. Sometimes lizards and bugs and other little creepy crawlies would worm their way into Bill White's coffin, but he didn't let that bother him. He just shoots him with some deodorant and he keeps on keeping on. One time, Bill White came out of the ground after a buried alive event and he immediately jumped into a helicopter, and the helicopter flew him over to a bar in Houston, Texas, and landed on the roof of the bar, and then the cops arrested him and the pilot because you're not allowed to do that. Bill was real mad because he had not even gotten a shower since he had first came out of the grave, and now he's got to go to jail. What kind of a bum deal is that? In 1968, in Charleston, West Virginia, Bill did a special buried alive event where he had himself buried in a 7.5-foot wide coffin with 2 go-go dancers. Just Bill and 2 women buried alive for weeks on end under 6 feet of dirt by themselves in a giant coffin. Old Bill White was constantly breaking his own record for the longest time spent buried alive. But his final coup de grace happened in 1978 when he spent 134 days buried beneath a radio station in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And during that time, a local reporter got a great pic of Bill down in his coffin by lowering a camera down through the breathing pipe. Like, there he is in his little home doing some hand exercises. You know, interestingly, the British edition of the Guinness Book of World Records does include Bill as the record holder for this category, but the American version does not. Why? Well, because the American editors didn't want to encourage people to try being buried alive themselves because they thought that it was too dangerous of a stunt. And old Bill, he responded to that sentiment by saying, okay, well, you got the record for eating a tree in your damn book, but you're not going to put me getting buried alive in there? Isn't eating a tree just as dangerous as getting buried alive?
I set records for spending low, like an ostrich in the sand. But you can't shut out the outside world with a telephone in each hand.
All right, this last one is kind of cheating because it's not actually about Country Bill White being buried alive. It's about his son, Country Ed White, being buried alive. See, in 1985, Bill's son Ed wanted to keep on with the family business, so he had himself buried alive behind a bar in Pasco, Florida. And there's Bill giving some friendly advice to his son. And there's Ed getting ready to have the box closed up, still wearing his sunglasses 6 feet under the earth. That first night underground, about 1 million people called up to talk to Ed on the phone, and almost all of them asked him the same question. How the hell do you go to the bathroom down there? Well, says Ed, that is a family secret, and I ain't gonna tell it. Thanks for watching.